Yesterday, I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today, I'm wise, so I'm changing myself.
What about tomorrow?
Technology is here before we expect it, and the best way for us to take the next step and create the future of health and medicine is to go and create it ourselves.
How? Let's journey into tomorrow and beyond.
Let's get into it. Welcome to tomorrow. For the first time ever, welcome to Health Beyond Tomorrow. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time, welcome. And for those of you who've been following my journey as host and producer of the MedTech podcast for the past 6 months, then I'm so excited to have you back. For that first episode back, I knew I needed to get a special guest. I knew I needed to get someone on who has that wow factor, who I could have an inspirational conversation with, but also talk about the reasons why I'm starting my own venture going forward. So here's to my first guest on Health Beyond Tomorrow, none other than the host and creator of the Big Picture Medicine podcast, the GOAT himself, Dr Mustafa Sultan, aka Musty. So as always, make sure you hit that follow button on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. Make sure you give the episode a like rating and hit the bell icon to make sure you don't miss out on any of my content. Thank you so much, guys, for sticking with me, and let's get into it. Yeah, to begin with, I think we might as well be transparent with the listeners. We actually recorded an episode, a couple of weeks ago, right? And it was a mentorship episode because I'd listened to your episode with Vishal and I loved it. I think it was number 84, number 94, something like that. So anyone listening, go and listen to the episode on Big Picture Medicine with Musty and Vishal. But it was a very different structure, and Vishal was giving you some mentoring advice. And so I reached out to you initially saying, you know what, I'm a couple years behind you, but I see myself in you and where I would like to be in a couple years. So would you mind coming on and let's just having a transparent conversation about the podcast, and I can come to you with any problems and you can mentor me and tell me ways you've tackled any problems because you've obviously gone through it. And so this episode is going to be a little bit of repeating what we said, but obviously now we can talk about the new problems I've been facing as I'm starting my venture again.
It's always tricky because the hardest part of doing a podcast like this is what do you do when you record a crap episode with someone? So the fact that we're re-recording, I honestly don't know if it was because I was crap the first time and you're being polite, but I'm honestly happy to be here.
the listeners will hear the first episode because there's so much valuable insights in the first episode, but I thought it would make more sense re-recording the episode, but just from the point of view now as Health Beyond Tomorrow, because my vision, though it hasn't changed, it is broadened now, and my future plans over the next couple of weeks are very different to where I was a couple of weeks ago, right? And so I think it makes the most sense, just restarting our recording and just doing it from scratch. So to begin with, tell me your why, Musty. Why did you start the Big Picture Medicine podcast?
So I think a lot of people lie when people ask them questions like this. I am a firm believer that in terms of what motivates people, it tends to be more of something along the lines of the 7 deadly sins rather than wanting to improve the world or some like big nebulous, goal like that, altruistic thing. So for me, to be honest, I was always listening to podcasts like Tim Ferriss and other like entrepreneur podcasts. And I just wondered, why doesn't this exist in the health space? Why aren't the kind of people that I want to be like represented in a podcast like this? I guess the other reason was also I came across this quote that's really common, which is you're the average of the 5 people you surround yourself with. And the big unlock with the internet was that you can finally control those people. And even if you're a bit weird, you're a bit of a nerd, you can actually find those people dotted around across the world and make those into the 5 people you surround yourself with the most. Obviously I love my friends, but if you can have the kind of, that kind of boardroom in your head of like the 12 most impressive people in your life and you can get their advice and things, then why not do it? So it was a very selfish thing, but then I guess the altruistic bit, or maybe the bit that just is easy to do, is why not, when I'm having these conversations, why not just publish it online so other people can benefit from it and try and build a bit of a media empire that way as well. So those are the honest reasons.
Yeah. So tell me, how strategic are you when you first started Big Picture Medicine? Did you have this view in mind, the next 3-5 years you're going to start leveraging this podcast to grow your personal brand, to take these different opportunities, or did you start it as a hobby?
So good question, because I think there's a trap where you can become too engrossed in like a 4D chess move and almost paralyze yourself by thinking too big. So initially it was just for me because I thought it was fun. And the first podcast I recorded with this really cool doctor called Abdullah Al-Bayati. And I initially just thought I'll go record it. And if it's crap, I'll just keep it on my hard drive and it will never go out to the world. And I think that's how you should start all creative projects. I think the paralysis bit comes from when you start thinking, I'm going to put this out into the world and get external feedback on this. And that's very, very scary, especially if it's your first time. So I recommend with anything creative, just take the pressure off yourself. Just say, I'm just going to do this for myself. It's going to be on my hard drive. If it's good, maybe I'll put it out, but I don't need to. So that's how it started. But I think very quickly, and look, I'm by no means some great success. So we'll see, you can track my journey in 5 or 10 years and see how it turns out. But I've had a view of long-termism. So I think a lot of people, medics, creators, when they do things, very quickly they start thinking of like, how am I going to monetize this? How am I going to make a few quid from this? And they think in like the next 6 months. And I think I've always had a view of this brand or this podcast as something that will be going on for 10 to 20 years. So that caused a lot of fundamental shifts in how I approach this that I think have actually started to come into benefit me now, thinking more about evergreen content and thinking, how am I going to make work today that I'm proud of in 10 years time as well. So yeah, to answer your question, it wasn't like some big thing. Initially, I made it very, very easy as an initial step, but then very quickly I took this long-termism view.
It's interesting because you mentioned 10, 20 years there, and I'm 22 years old. So if you take my life and go back 10 years, okay, I was a completely different person. Obviously 10 years ago I was a child, but where do you see yourself, or where do you see your values being in 10 years to 20 years, and where do you see the podcast fitting in with those values, and how will the podcast change around you?
Yeah, good question. So I read a lot recently into mimetic desire, which is I think Rene Girard stuff. But basically it says that we get all of our desires from people around us. So like, it's about why do we want what we want? And that was a huge, almost like acid trip for me in the sense that it orientated me quite well. So initially, I think what I wanted was always okay, I'm going to make $1 billion company. And, maybe that will be something that I do pursue one day. But I think it really made me look back and think, okay, why do I want what I want? And do I want it for the good reasons? And the end game that I've chosen now is there are people who I view online, like there's Azim Azar who makes Exponential View, another brown guy. But he's grown this brand where he does this weekly newsletter where he does really good analysis into lots of different sectors, but in the intersections of technology, and loads and loads of people read it. So I think he has 100,000 readers, maybe 10,000 of those are paid. He charges $100 a year for that. So very quickly you can see how he's making just $1 million off those fees, and then he's doing other stuff as well. So in total, he's probably making $5 to $10 million a year from his business, and he just writes about cool stuff, travels, just pursues his interests really. So for me, that was that's a really cool end goal. He invests off the back of that. So I don't know exactly where I'm going to end up, but I think it is important to think this game I'm playing, what's the end goal? And a lot of your listeners will be medics, so you can see the end goal every time you go into the ward that you're currently on, which is being a consultant, and that may or may not be for you. I don't want to shit on it too much because it's it's a great career and you help people and it's it's one of the most noble professions, but just have a think is that really what my end goal is?
Yeah. And it's interesting because did you know that you always didn't want to practice clinically, so going through med school? Even before applying to med school, did you always have in the back of your head, is this what I really want out of life?
So I think initially, my parents are Pakistani immigrants, and my dad is really my hero, and he's my model for what it means to be a man, and he was a doctor. So that was my whole identity was okay, I need to become a doctor. And it was almost becoming one that was more important than practicing in some ways. And it's within the Asian community, there's a whole thing about prestige and achievement, that's unlocked. Yeah. But strangely enough, as soon as you become a doctor, that's kind of enough. You've got all the clout and kudos. So I think once that had happened, I kind of turned around and was okay, but is this really what I want to do? And look, I thought clinical medicine is pretty cool, but I quickly realized, I think about halfway through medical school, that's I'm not a player. I'm probably B team in this. I'm not Maybe if I really tried, I could become A team, but I'd probably be like, on the bench. So I thought, why don't I pick something where I can be the A team? And then I started to think, like, what am I thinking about when I'm in the shower? Like, as a very real example, I think in my third year of med school, I think I was 8th decile, so like in the bottom 20% of that year, something like that. And I was like, oh shit. And then I went to Imperial to do the management degree, which was like basically a degree in health tech and business. And I got onto the dean's list for that, so I was like top 10%. So, and I didn't try any harder. I'd kind of done a similar amount of work, but it was just because every time we did something, I'd read up on it, I'd be thinking about it in the shower. And then I was like, okay, like, am I on the right path here? So that was quite a big bit of evidence for me to leave.
Yeah. I'm curious, what would you say is the key to a successful podcast? Because we've had multiple different conversations now going forward, and I'm pestering you all the time now since I've got to know you a bit better and pestering you to ask you it for advice. What would you say differentiates an average podcast to a good podcast?
Yeah, so look, here's the advice that everyone says that I don't fully agree with, because everyone says it's consistency, and I agree to that to some extent, because basically one of two things will happen if you keep going. Either you'll keep playing the game and keep putting out content, or you'll win. And if you keep going, those are the only two outcomes that can happen, because obviously the third outcome is that you quit, and that's what most people do. So you see in podcast land, it's the land of the 6-episode podcast, I believe. I think it's something like 50% of podcasts don't go past episode 6. So clearly you need to get past that. And I think part of it is just playing the game. And that was certainly like the Ali Abdaal advice, which was very influential for me, which was like, he says, just do something every week for 2 years, whether that's podcasting, YouTube, writing. And I agree with that like 70%. I think the bit that's not included in that advice, and I think is very important, is that you do need to keep iterating. And I think people fall into a trap when they're making creative content, and I've definitely done this, where there's a lot of pressure to put out content every week. And I know you've experienced this because you've been incredibly consistent for 6 months, and it's not easy, because if you're putting a podcast out every 7 days, if you think about all the research, organizing the guest, recording the episode, editing it, that's like a 3-4 day process in itself. So you're basically constantly doing the next episode. It's not easy. But I think it is important in that time frame to build in some time to like think back and think, how can this next one be better than the past one? Let me give you a very real example. Every beginner podcast, and the first 100 episodes of mine have done this as well, so I'm not saying it as if I'm looking down on those people, but every interview podcast starts with, so tell me about your story. And it's because it's easy. It's like everyone else does it, so why don't I? But you'll quickly start realizing that most people are not very good at telling your story, including me. You just asked me my story. I don't know if you'll include it or not, but it's not like I'm not super good at it. And that's ironic given I do this so much, because it's very, unless you're like a natural performer and you've been media trained and you've been doing this 20 years, or maybe you've done drama, you're probably not good at storytelling. So think of, how can I change the structure of what I'm doing? How can I break away from the mold? Okay, I know the rules. There's that quote about great artists and how you need to know the rules to break the rules. Okay, you've done the first 20 episodes, you've done this format, but think about the next one. How am I going to make this even better? I think the last point I'll say on making a really good podcast is it's really easy, in my opinion, in health and any kind of traditional field, if you're doing like law or anything, which is just look at what people are doing in places like business and design and actual like storytelling. So I'm talking like This American Life and Serial. So just look at other industries and you just copy what they're doing. They'll be 10 years ahead of us. And if you bring elements of what's good, if you listen to like a really good storytelling narrative and you think, whoa, like how did Guy Raz is a really good one, how I built this. If you notice that, okay, instead of just asking a guest, like, what's your story? He doesn't do that. He does that in the build up to the interview, but he asks specific pointed questions because he's already researched what the guest story is, and he'll ask them at specific points that he knows are interesting. So like that's something I'm trying to do. So the thing I'm trying to say is like great artists steal, so copy off other people, but also keep iterating. Don't just keep on bashing out content because you need to keep improving each time.
Sure. What would you say is, so obviously a lot of podcasts die after 6 episodes, you say. I think it's 10% make it past episode 20. What would you say is more important in the early stage, quality or quantity then?
This again, so the classic example, and I keep on quoting Ali Abdaal because he does loads of good creator content that I think all creatorpreneur medics consume. And he always gives the pottery class example where they take a class that are making pottery, and one group are given the task of making like 1,000 vases, and the other group make like one great one. And the group that made 1,000 made a better vase in the end. And that is evidence for just doing lots of repetition. Now, I don't know if I agree with that. I would say that you should have a really high quality bar. And I think that you should have a standard that's really, really high. But that shouldn't be so far that you can never reach it. So you shouldn't fall into the trap of perfectionism. So I think it's quite helpful to think like, what is my minimum line of quality? And that can be, for example, that if the audio, if it's not a pleasure for me to hear, or if the audio quality is so bad that I can't make out what the person's saying, I'm not going to release the episode. That's just like one of my rules. If the person who came on started like self-promoting too much, or they were really boring, or there were like so many ums and ahs that you can't really listen to it comfortably, if for whatever reason, if you have this like line of quality, and if it drops below that, then you won't release it. So I think that's like a good balance between it. The quantity point, I think the advice to put out loads of content is generally good, but I would say for most people, it's better to level back and put out less content and focus more on quality. The reason I say that is because there was advice in the early days of like internet content that came from people like Gary Vee, and that worked, which was to basically be putting out like 6 different bits of content every day, keep on smashing content into the algorithm, and eventually a few bits of those will surface. And I think that worked in the old days with the ways the algorithms worked. I think that doesn't work as well now. And the way the new algorithms work is that they reward really high quality content. We see creators like, say, CoffeeZilla. There's loads of others that don't come to mind. But they put out like a really good piece of work less frequently. And I think that kind of model works better.
Yeah, it's interesting because you would think that by putting out twice as much content, it increases your reach twice as much, right? But I've noticed as well now, even posting stuff on TikTok, the algorithm definitely prefers a quality 2-minute video where I'm providing value to listeners over just like a 30-second like easy clip I can make that takes me 5 minutes, in comparison to one where I've had to write a script and actually think what would be useful for med students my age, etc.
If you're putting out loads of like average content every day, 6 times a day, that is not good for your brand. That is damaging to your brand. So maybe it might get some short-term results, but I think if you put out like real content that you're really proud of infrequently, that actually does build a bit of a reputation. And in 10 years, you're also going to have a corpus of work you're proud of. So I would say, yeah, if you think about like the long game, I think that you will actually put out more quality content less frequently. And it's better for the world as well, because who needs more content?
We have opposing views on TikTok, right? Tell me what you think about posting short form content around your podcast on TikTok.
Okay, so this comes to thinking about the end game and thinking about what game am I playing. And it applies to every aspect of life, I think. So think about the shorts creators and just look at where they're at. Like the really great ones. I don't actually know any. If you look at the end game and also apply the lens of someone like us, so someone who's making content that is like more, I don't know, academic, more like thinky in like quotation marks, like what is the end game there? Like if you become like a really great TikTok creator, like I don't know if there's like a really solid monetization model that's going to last beyond the platform. There's evidence as well. I think I linked you a tweet that maybe you could put in the description where the guys who do the My First Million podcast, their head of growth, posted a graph. And it was basically that I think they'd got something like 14 million TikTok views. And that had converted to something like 1,000 podcast downloads, that conversion is crazy low. And if you think like someone like me or you, if we really go ham on TikTok, maybe we could do like, I don't know, 10,000 views in a month. And if that's getting like a 0.0001 conversion, it's almost a waste of time. So my 2 criticisms of shorts are that I don't think there's a good end game in terms of like a good financial model, because it's harder to get people off the platform and get them onto like a more evergreen distribution channel. And secondly, I could be wrong, because I could be like the Luddite who's like got his, the camel who puts their head into the sand. So maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I'll look back at this and be like, I'm an idiot and so on. But I don't think there's a good end game there for people like us, especially making long form content.
I disagree, because I think it depends on what your end game is. So we could have different end games, right? So what you're saying does make sense, because if your end game is just looking for a channel to monetize, yeah, it wouldn't make sense. There's not much money in TikTok. But the reason, as I've said multiple times, the reason I started this podcast is to encourage more students to embrace tech and innovation. And long form content, especially amongst the younger demographic, isn't consumed as much as short form content. And I want my reach to literally reach the masses, if that makes sense, rather than be confined to just the people that listen to long form content. And so the way I do that is by leveraging small clips of the podcast, posting on TikTok. Even if one person out of 1,000 views, they then go on to listen to the whole podcast and learn something. For me, that's a win, because then I've educated someone and someone's learned something. So I think it depends on what your goal is in the long term. And my goal in the long term is honestly just to inspire, as we've already had a conversation about. So maybe we can talk about the long-term goals and the reasons, motivations for the podcast as well. So what would you say is your driving factor for carrying on consistently pushing content? Because sometimes you do get weeks where you're like, you know what, I haven't recorded an episode. Like, shit, I have no one like coming up. What do I do? Or you just are busy. Like with med school, obviously being a doctor, so there's some weeks that are hectic and I just haven't had time to like edit a podcast. What is your driving force to make sure that episode still goes out that week?
Very good point. And just to reiterate that it is very, very difficult. And there's people who do way harder stuff. Like there's people who like carry like, I don't know, logs on their back up like this, like Sherpas. Like they do hard work. Yeah. So I don't want to say that me sitting on the computer is like really
just
backbreaking
at your
work.
screen. Yeah.
Yeah. But no, it's pretty hard. I'm a hero. But so my motivation is probably twofold. So the first thing is that I think anyone who likes to create like any form of media or even like business and entrepreneurship, fundamentally you look at the world and you think there's something there that doesn't exist that I think I can make, and I think I can do it better than everyone else. Like, because if you thought that you're putting out stuff that is in no way better than what already exists, you probably would stop quite quickly. Like I'm not, going to be making like a great chef, like a great restaurant, because I can't cook. So I think fundamentally you do have that belief that you think there should be something in the world that doesn't already exist. So I think that's probably the big one. And I don't want to sound like too grandiose when I say this, but every time I do like a really good podcast, it does feel like I'm making like a great piece of art almost. And again, that does sound like I'm very up myself.
No, I completely understand it and completely agree where you're coming from. Even a small, like if I'm making a thumbnail on YouTube and I'm like, yeah, you know what, that looks cool. It is an art in general. It's we're creating something, and so I would say yes, it is an art. So you're allowed to be proud of what you're producing. It's an art.
Absolutely. And then the other thing is about picking a game that, like, I think anyone who's ambitious likes playing the game, and it's a bit nebulous what the game actually means, but I think it's about going out there, doing hard work and getting a sense of achievement. And I think anyone who is ambitious probably resonates with that. Like, why there's that quote, where it's like, why did you go and climb that mountain? Because it was there. Like, that's why I did it. It was just there, so I did it. Yeah. So there is something about playing the game, and then there's also something about playing a game that you think you're uniquely good at or unfairly good at. And I think both of us have that with this kind of thing where we're both medics by background, but we both enjoy creating and interviewing and discussing ideas. So maybe that's our unlock. That's the thing that we're going to be really good at. So part of it is also that it's a fun game. The last thing I will say is that this is the more practical reason rather than the philosophical one, where it's good to build a distribution channel that aligns with what you want to do going forward. So for example, I haven't figured out exactly what I want to do in life, but there's no harm in having distribution to the kinds of people that you want to be working with or you want as customers, etc. There's no harm in that. And there's no harm in just the like networking unlock of doing that. So it's like multiple reasons, but those are the big ones.
Yeah. You mentioned, so you say the game then, we've already mentioned about kind of whether we look at it as like a chessboard and like we're making strategic moves. And you've obviously mentioned Ali Abdul there. And I think it's a great story on how you got Ali Abdul on the podcast, because I think it is very strategic and almost it complements the word, the game, a strategic chess move. So tell me about how you got Ali Abdul on the podcast and what other creative ways you've reached out to cool guests to get them on.
Okay, so the general lesson from this is that the big networking unlock is that the more analog you can go in a digital world, the more success you're going to have, because the activation energy or the cost to send an email or a DM is like zero, so they don't work. So there's almost like a sacrificial thing you have to do if you want to get in touch with someone who's like above your pay grade. So my example was Ali Abdal. So at this point he was on like 600k subscribers. I think now he's on a few million.
Smashing it. Yeah. I mean, he's completely
smashing
branched. Was he still a doctor at that point when you got him on? Because now he's just completely doing productivity advice.
I think he was coming to the end of his tenure or he just started full time. And I was like, okay, how do I get this guy on? So obviously try all the usual channels and they don't work, unsurprisingly, because he's probably getting 1,000 DMs a day. So he does a video where he's reviewing a keyboard. And this is the most Ali Abdal video ever because it's an iPad keyboard that looks like an old school typewriter. So it's like totally like not functional, but it looks kind of cool. And then I like think, okay, I see an in here. So I go onto this website where you can get them to write you like a typewritten letter. So like on really like old school paper and it's like typewritten. And I think it's meant to be, you know, for like Valentine's Day or like a happy birthday type thing. But I used it for Ali Abdal. So I got it to say something like, will you be on my podcast? ? And then like my email and sent it to him. The other part was finding his address. So this is another unlock. You can go on anyone who's like entrepreneurial, they probably set up a company. And if they're based in the UK, they may have their address available on Company's House. So I found his address on there, sent the letter, and then like 2 days later got an email being like, sure, here's my Calendly. So yeah, I think the unlock there was just do analog stuff and just do something that's a bit like shows that you made an effort. You need to display that you've invested some energy into this. By the way, even if you're sending an email, that can be like you demonstrating that you know a lot about them or that you've researched them, or you can be like, I listened to every podcast you've ever done and I've made 6 questions that I think no one has ever asked you before. Like that just shows someone that you're serious, and you'll be surprised at how many people will reply to that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Firstly, I reckon Ali Abdul's going to get like 200 letters from the audience. Just everyone just messaging him, sending letters to him. You know what? I'm going to actually do it. You need to send me the link to that website where I can get a type.
We'll post his address.
We'll post his address, yeah. Communal address, make a PO box. Everyone send something to Ali Abdul. Everyone just spam him saying, come on Ash's podcast. But yeah, no, I think it is... It's a game. It is a game. Someone said that to me, and they asked me, "What you're doing, is it strategic?" And I said, "You know what? To begin with, like you said, it wasn't. It was just because I love what I'm doing and I enjoy it." And then I started getting feel for it. I started to fall in love with podcasting in general, and then now I'm almost looking at like in the longevity, like a game and a strategic chess move, which is hence why I've now set up Beyond Tomorrow, which is in itself not just a podcast. Beyond Tomorrow is something that I'm setting up as a content ecosystem, which I want to inspire, hence the name says Beyond Tomorrow, where we're encouraging health professionals to think outside the box, but not just through long form content like podcasts, but actually through blog posts, through interviews, through newsletters, through TikToks, through Instagrams. And that's the way I see myself inspiring to the masses. So I'm not just siloed into only people that listen to long form content are being inspired, or only people that read blogs are being inspired. I wanted to create a channel where everyone listens to at least a podcast, or reads a blog, or reads an interview, or reads a newsletter, or watches a TikTok. So that way I'm reaching everyone at the same time. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, so firstly, I think it's like a really like noble goal, and I think you're definitely the person who can go out and achieve it. You're clearly like committed, and you've got a lot of like commitment in the sense that you've shown up every week for 6 months, which is incredibly hard to do, and you've been putting out really good stuff. So that's the first thing. I like your style a lot. So I guess the difference between, say, where I was at episode 20 and even up to 100 is I'm not massively conversational in the podcasts I do. I'm a bit more like laid back interviewer, like question answer. And I think you have a cool style where it's a bit more conversational and you'll put in a bit of stuff, but you'll not steal the spotlight either. So I think you've got a really good balance of that. So I think essentially I like your style. So I think that's another good part of it. So yeah, I think you'll definitely do well at it. I don't overly. I mean, I told you this before. I don't overly get the mission because I think inspiring doctors to think bigger, like, and think of careers outside of medicine. I don't really see it because I think that anyone, at least from the UK context, there seems like there's enough of like a push factor in the sense that the NHS career is so
Yeah,
terrible that almost don't need the pull. So that's
yeah.
my
But it's not
take on the
actually
mission.
just it's not actually just getting people to look at careers outside of medicine. I couldn't care less if people stay in the NHS or not. It's more actually just getting people to think creatively, because I think being an entrepreneur or doing this podcast, it's allowed me to look at things creatively, and it's benefited me in loads of different aspects in life. And I want other people to see that value of being able to look at stuff creatively and see the benefits that has, because I think traditionally at med school we're just taught to just follow the same route, stick to the same path, don't veer from that path, and that we almost lose our creativity at med school. And so I guess my mission statement, if I was to say like a phrase, it would literally be inspire to be creative again, because we're obviously born creative as well.
That's really cool. And I guess the big, like, great feeling will be when people have done stuff and made content or made businesses or done like big things based on the stuff you've put out. So yeah, absolutely. It's cool.
Yeah, I mean, that would probably be the end goal. I love it when someone comes up to me and says, like, just randomly at a conference, and firstly, you know, it's such a surreal feeling actually, because I've only been doing this for 6 months, and to already get people who I've never met before come up to me and say, "Oh, I love your podcast." It's firstly an amazing feeling, but then secondly,
People like throw eggs at me. They're like,
yeah.
they're like, F you.
Yeah, your podcast is shit. But yeah, no, it is a great feeling. And would you say you're an overthinker, an anxious person in general?
Not really. So I think about when I was 18, I decided to stop being anxious and overthinking.
Or just like that?
Just like that. I think it was quite it sounds a bit stupid, but it was quite a conscious decision. I basically thought, I've grown up quite anxious all my life, and it's been really beneficial actually, because there's huge benefits to being anxious. Because I guess if you're anxious, you're kind of stuck worrying about the future. And there are benefits to that. You won't make mistakes as much because you're kind of preempting them. And then if you're like a laid back chill person, that's great. But you do, like, now I'm more chill. There are huge problems with that. I do miss deadlines. I do have problems. But then I just kind of thought along the way, like, what's the worst that can happen? And that obviously comes from like an incredible position of privilege, because for someone like me, the worst that can happen is that you basically move in with your parents. It's not like you're going to end up on the street or you're not going to have like medical care or something. So that is like from a huge position of privilege. And especially once you get your medical license, you do start to think, like, if I go out here, I like spend a few years just doing this podcast full time or trying to build a business, what's the worst that can happen? I do locums as an SHO in like an acute medical unit. It's not the worst thing. And really people within the medical industry will know that you're kind of just like a perpetual SHO locum and you're not really progressing in your career. But to everyone else, you're basically a doctor. So you've still got all that clout. So I think, I'm not that anxious.
Yeah. No, the reason I asked is just because I do overthink and I get anxious easily. But I was wondering if you saw it as a driver, and it's how you've managed to stay, just to stay consistent in the long run. I don't know how you feel about that, but one of the ways that I don't know, you could look at it as a good way, or a good thing or a bad thing, but I guess my anxiety sometimes drives me thinking, you know what, I need to produce an episode this week. I can't miss next week. And it's always been like that my whole life. It's not like, so I'm just wondering from your perspective if you've ever had that as well.
Oh, that's an interesting perspective. Yeah. So like the anxiety of like, what are people going to think if I don't put out this episode? Or I've made this like big claim now, I need to deliver on that. Yeah.
Or you go on like a 1 month hiatus when you say nothing because you're being on holiday. Would you get anxious and overthink in that scenario and be like, you know what, I should have uploaded, like I need to upload?
I think my anxiety more would be like my channel is going to die if I don't if I don't upload. It's an interesting perspective, but no, it's not. I've never made the connect between like anxiety being something that helps you be productive, which is quite interesting that it works like that for you. I think for me, it's probably just a net negative. The only way it helps is that if you're not anxious, you can sometimes be a bit of an idiot and be the kind of person who's late to stuff, misses stuff, and like really makes like stupid mistakes.
So we discussed, if I was to meet you in person, your persona is completely different to online, like us chatting right now. But I met you in person. I didn't think it was actually that different. So tell me, what's the difference between Musty, Big Picture Medicine podcast host Musty to just Musty in person saying hi.
Yeah, this is an interesting point because I think it's this like line of authenticity. So when you're putting yourself out there to the public, are you going to be like really authentic, or are you going to craft like a persona for yourself? So I would argue that when you did meet me in person, you probably saw my crafted persona more than you saw like the real me. And I think that's very important, actually. So I think there's this move right now that, like, in the zeitgeist of like people like Joe Rogan, maybe Russell Brand, these kinds of entertainers who are very, very authentic. I mean, Joe Rogan doesn't edit his podcast. He's just real. He turns up seemingly having done no prep. So I think in a lot of like creators and people like that, there's like this whole thing about I'm going to be really authentic. I'm going to really be me. I'm not going to like iron out any of my faults. I'm going to speak how I normally speak. I don't think that's a good idea personally. Like maybe it works for you in a certain capacity as an entertainer, but I think it's important to separate your identity. And it's just about projection. Like, and again, it comes back to what's your end goal. Like, is putting myself out there, is the end goal of that people on the internet basically get a really good scope into my life. I mean, we saw this with Casey Neistat, who did a daily vlog for like 3 years. He did like 900 episodes, and he was like vlogging his family on that all the time. And suddenly, like millions of people know everything about him and his family. And I think by the end, it really put a stressor on his whole life. So I know I've kind of taken that like ad absurdum and taken that too far. But I will say that I think it's worth thinking about. This is me with my mates, and this is how I act. This is my like online persona, and these two things have very, very different goals, and they should reflect that. Like, one of the things I did, like as an example of something that's not very authentic and that's like more crafted, is I had a session with a speech coach. So Chris Williamson is a really big podcaster. He does Modern Wisdom, and he's a mutual friend through Yusuf. And he mentioned that he got a speech coach, and he's a huge podcaster. So I was like, well, fuck it. Like, I should get a huge speech coach as well. And he helps me say some things better. I've not really been practicing that during this conversation because it's a bit more chilled, but he gave me loads of tips. And like, I think that's a really good example. But like when I'm speaking with my friends, I don't really use any of them. So yeah, I think it's worth, to answer your question, I think it's worth being not too authentic and like having like a front.
But equally, there is that push for authenticity, and you should just be natural in front of a camera, because people are gonna look through you if you've got a mask on, and they're gonna see that you're not genuine. Like me personally, I think I'm pretty similar when I talk to the camera as I am in person. Obviously there's like I wouldn't say some things that I would to my friends obviously on the podcast, but that's just life, right? You with different people, you know where the line is and what you can and can't say. But I think in terms of being authentic, I've always strived with the podcast just to be myself, because that's all I know. Is that something that you've built up from day one, and now to the third year of you doing episodes? Have you slowly just built this mask up, or built this persona, or is this something that you switched on from day one and always had?
Yeah, it's a good point. And firstly, I'll say that I think that's part of your charm, and I think you're certainly like more of a charming person. And I think when I listen to your
thank you.
podcast and things, I'm like, I really like this guy. Like, I'd like to hang out with this guy. And I think that's part of you being an authentic person and feeling like this is just someone who's real, having like an authentic conversation. So there's definitely a benefit in that. The flip side of that, I will say, is, and this is from the writings of Seth Godin, he talks about how when you're doing something creative or you're making stuff, it's not really a natural thing. Like, for you to be having conversations and recording them and putting them out every week on a schedule, nothing about that is authentic or natural. And you are doing a performance, essentially, because if you weren't doing a performance, you wouldn't hit record, right? You would just have the conversation. So I think that's like one way I think of it. I think that this isn't actually me in a way. And I think there's also a risk that if you are too authentic, and by the way, I think this applies differently to different people and it depends on your goals. So I totally back what you're doing as well. But the way I think about it is that if I craft someone, then that person's more kind of changeable rather than being this like immutable object that this is the authentic me. So if you're too authentic, maybe you won't work on like your ums and ahs or, the kind of things you do. Whereas if you kind of craft someone, I think you can really make something great. And I think the way I've started thinking about this more is like as a professional and less as like an amateur creator. And I think potentially when you do have that mind switch, I think you do start crafting a bit of a persona. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I definitely do ours a lot, all those filler words, and that's just because I'm literally just being authentic. I'm having a conversation, and this is how I speak normally. And so for me, I've always struggled switching on, being a bit more professional, talking a bit slower, pronouncing each word like we discussed. I mean, I as I go on through the journey, I'm sure I'll probably get to that point where, you know what, there is a bit of a persona and I'm speaking a bit more slowly, etc. But yeah, interesting, because at the moment I feel like I'm just being myself.
And Esh, I will say the one thing for people like us is the biggest problem with being too authentic, and I'm not saying this is something you would do, but when you're being your authentic self, you just throw offhanded opinions out like that. So you say like, if you're talking about football, oh, Messi, he's shit or something. You don't even think about it, like flyaway comments. Now, if we do that in our arena where we are, there's actually a big potential that can come back and bite you later on. So I think that's another part of being a bit more like less authentic, is to think about, what am I putting out, assuming that anything that goes on the internet will last forever and it will come back to bite you, and having to temper your authenticity a bit, because again, this is not a natural thing.
No, that's fantastic advice there, actually. That's definitely something I will think about, because me saying something now could be a completely different opinion in 5 years' time. Because if I think about myself when I was 16, I had some viewpoints that I completely don't agree with now. And so, yeah, you want to make sure that you're always you're always thinking forward.
We'll dig up your old Twitter.
Yeah. And so, having stepped down now as the host of the MedTech podcast and going on this venture to now start Beyond Tomorrow, I'm curious on your opinion, and if you think, what makes the Big Picture podcast? Is it you, or is it the channel that you've built?
Yeah, this is a good point, because there's this book called Build It to Sell, and that talks a lot about how when you're building a business, you should set it up in a way that means that it would function without you, because then it can be packaged up nicely to sell or for someone else to take over. There's this concept in business of like key man risk or key person risk, where, you have, like, for example, Steve Jobs, and he's like the face of Apple, and then he dies, and then like that's a huge problem. But they've recovered from that and done even better. But anyway, that's like one side of it. The other side of it is that, like, and I think that what works for you a lot is like your charm and your conversational skills, and like that is a huge part of it. And there's also like thinking about how the people who listen to you currently and the people who will listen to you in the future, they're developing like a parasocial relationship with you. And they, I think Sean Puri from My First Million has this really cool quote where he says that people come for the content, but they stay for the vibe. And I notice this a lot in like even podcasts like The Rest is Politics, where a lot of the times I don't really know what they're talking about. I'm not even that interested in like, the local by-election in like Dorset or something, but I just like their patter. I like, it feels like you're hanging out with them. So to answer your question, I would say that the person is more important. I've seen podcasts that seem to rotate hosts around a lot, and I don't think they work well. And the caveat I will say to that, though, is that you need to still have the long-termism mindset, and do think like, in 10 years, is this going to make sense? Is there anything I should do differently today based on, in a way that I would be grateful in 10 years' time? So still have some long-termism, but I say like personality is absolutely key.
Yeah. And considering I am literally starting from episode 1 again, I want to ask you the question: what would you do if you had to do it again? You were starting from episode 1 today. What would you do differently going forward?
I think I would have got out of this trap of needing to post loads and loads of episodes, and really have made so say I've done 120 episodes. And by the way, everyone on the podcast I've ever had, I've reached out to personally. So it's people I really, really value and think are awesome. But I would think like, what if I'd only done 30 episodes in 3 years, but every episode was a banger? Like even from my end, like I'd really like spent, because there were times when I was doing 4 episode recordings in a week and going to med school and working as a junior doctor. You can't like research anyone to any good detail, and you can't prepare properly. You just basically turn up and just like Joe Rogan, just think of questions. Yeah. It's just wing it. And now I look back at that, I'm like, I used to see, this is about the authenticity bit. I used to be like, okay, I'm just being authentic. I'm just being like the everyman, just asking the easy questions. But really, I was being lazy. So I think I would say I would dial back and be like, I'm going to release like a banger every 2 weeks or every month. And I think that would have been an interesting experiment to try. And by the way, I don't know if the end result would have been better or worse, but I think that is something that I would do if I was to start again. The other thing I think, and this is like really applicable to what you're doing, is realizing that the numbers of your podcast in terms of like plays and downloads actually don't matter, because the kinds of people we want to interview don't really care. Like some of them do, and certainly their marketing departments do care. But if you're reaching out directly to the person, they don't care. What they do care about is your references, your network, if anyone recommends you, how you got the introduction. So as an example, Lex Friedman, I think it was episode 17, he got Elon Musk on his podcast. And I'm pretty sure he was a nobody. Like, you can fact check that.
Yeah.
But I was like, how did he get him? And he didn't even have a massive audience, but it was purely because he must have got an introduction to him, known someone. So my point is that I would really like focus on like nurturing the network approach, because I had this vision in my head of like, okay, once I get to like 100,000 plays an episode, then I'll be able to get anyone. Then Elon Musk will come and talk about Neuralink. But that's not how it works. Like, I'm telling you, like, you could get Elon Musk for your second episode if you knew someone who knew Elon Musk. Now that sounds like a stupid point, but even if you had 1 million plays per episode, you couldn't get Elon Musk. But if you had 10 plays and you knew someone, you could get Elon Musk. So that's like one frame shift in how I would think about getting people as well. Yeah. Let me add one more thing as well, Ash, which is I think to be and I've seen you do this as well. Like I've seen you at conferences kind of, push yourself out there and like just
run up to people.
Run up and corner people.
Yeah.
And I will say that like there's so many times that I had a really good, well-connected guest on who like probably liked me. And at the end, when I was meant to ask them, I know you know so and such, can you introduce me? Or like, can you introduce me to anyone? I wimped out basically. And you will always regret those like opportunities you missed. Like I don't want to sound like a Chinese like cracker or whatever it is, but you do take those, like do be uncomfortably brave. Like you should be embarrassing yourself every time, and you should look back and be like, oh, like did I really say that? Like she must think I'm an idiot. But just be brave with what you ask for as well.
Yeah, that is fantastic advice. Definitely something I'm going to be taking forward. Just be brave. I mean, I put myself out there a lot already, but again, I'm going to just 10x it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we were at Intelligent Health, and someone from Google gave a talk, and literally as soon as he walked off stage, I could just tell like 10 people were getting up behind me to go speak to him. I literally ran over to him. So I was the first person, and I was like, yes, let me get you on the podcast. And so like, just stuff like that. Just don't care. And anyone else also listening in general with life, don't care what anyone thinks at all. So Musty, it has been a pleasure having you for the second time. So this episode is going to be obviously the first introduction episode for Beyond Tomorrow, which I'm very excited for. And any final thoughts, any last bit of advice for me going forward, starting my venture from scratch again?
So I'll give you one more compliment, which is that I learned this from Tim Ferriss. He did some writing on how to be a good interviewer. And it's like front loading the question works really well. So one thing you do, and you've done throughout this conversation, is that you will ask a question. So you'll ask my thoughts on something, and then you'll give me 20 seconds where you kind of share your own insight. And a lot of times for a listener, that's a bit confusing, but it's actually a way of giving the guest time to think as well. And when I initially started, I was very much like hardcore Q&A. So I would be like, what's the best book you've ever read? And silence. Yeah. Whereas if you go like, what's the best book you've ever read? And like, whilst you think like one that comes to my mind, do you know what I mean? If you give a bit of time. So that's actually a really good interview technique, I noticed. So that's one compliment. In terms of advice, I will say, the last bit I will say is that there is a risk of getting into the hyper optimization paradox of looking at analytics and looking at what works well and like vanity metrics. And I will include in that shorts content, but you don't have to, because clearly it like serves what you're trying to do. But I will say, for example, like, short social media shares, etc. And it looks very, very good. And I think it can set you down the wrong path a bit. And you see a lot of creators who go down these weird like holes where they become more and more extreme because they're like almost like adhering to the algorithm too much. And in our example, I don't think we're going to end up like Andrew Tate, but we are going to end up where we maybe keep on making shallower and shallower content and more like clickbaity stuff, and like what I think is overall stuff that's worse for the world. And I think that's a very easy trap to fall in if you rely too much on like vanity metrics. Whereas I think like good metrics to think about, and I struggle with this as well. I think the good metrics are like people who DM you and say like, I love your podcast. I've shared it with 6 different people. Please keep on going. Like that, and you would have received this, and that is like that makes your day. So I think that is something more to prioritize for those kinds of responses, rather than, okay, this episode got 1,000 downloads because I put a clickbait title about like AI will take over the world. And really those people like listened for 5 seconds and then clicked it off, and you didn't really do anything. So that is one thing that I struggle with myself. And there are benefits of chasing vanity metrics, by the way, because when you speak to like marketing departments, if you can say my podcast has 10,000 downloads an episode, that is amazing. Like they don't know that the average listener only listens for 2 seconds. So there are benefits to that. But I will say that overall, as part of your like long-term plan, I do think it's worth like thinking about what metrics am I going to prioritize.
Yeah, great advice there. And Musty, I just want to say thank you so much for not coming on once, but actually coming on twice and helping me out through these past couple of weeks, and just, mentoring me and being there for me. And and also just listening to me whilst I'm pestering you, like spamming you on WhatsApp with those different messages. Honestly, it means a lot to me, because this is obviously a new this path hasn't been trodden by many people. There's not many people out there who actually understand this whole realm of podcasting. Whereas you have a lot of insights, and the insights is extremely, extremely beneficial and means a lot to me, more than you can imagine. So thank you so much for coming on.
No, thank you so much. And I really enjoy talking about this. I think you're going to do great things. I think you've got all the primordial soup, all the building blocks to like create something great with this. And I think you will, in fact. So if anything, is selfishness from me to just be on the journey.